Josh and Melissa and the Brown Club of DC here this evening. For those of you for whom this is the first time at the Potter's House, we are so glad you're here. For those of you for whom it is not the first time, welcome back. We are a nonprofit social enterprise. We've been here since 1960, so we have almost 60 years of service to this community. We have always been a hub for action and activism and creative expression and community transformation. And we're excited to continue doing more of that. And we really work hard to live into our values of justice and solidarity and spirit and care for the earth. So this feels like we are not afraid at the Potter's House of complicated conversations, and there are some complicated conversations I think to be had this evening. So we're delighted to have you here. And with that, I will turn it over to Corey.
I'm Corey Levin. I'm the current president of the Brown Club of DC. We're a nonprofit organization that aims to put on events for Brown alumni and their friends in the DC area. We aim to foster community and further intellectual curiosity with events such as this one and our annual membership event. That'll take place on November 16th. And it will feature Professor Gutman, who will talk about toxic masculinity in light of his upcoming book, Are Men Animals? How Modern Masculinity Sells Men Short. And we will actually have Malika Sadeh-Sar as the moderator for that event. She was the founder and executive director of the Human Rights Project for Girls and is now Google's senior counsel on civil and human rights. If you would like to get more involved with the Brown Club, talk to myself or Sean. He is also a board member after the event. And with that, I'll turn it over to Alyssa Silverman, another Brown alum and an at-large DC Council member.
Excellent. Well, good evening, everyone. Is this being recorded? Is that why we need the mics?
Only one.
Oh, okay. I don't think we need them, Josh. Well, good evening, everyone. I'm Alyssa Silverman. I'm an at-large council member, more importantly to this crowd. I'm a Brown class of 95, which I think we have another Brown alum. How many folks here are Brown alums, just out of curiosity? Okay, so about half the room or so. How many are fans of Josh Levin? All right, there we go. Every hand should go up. So I'll tell you a little bit. I didn't realize I was going to do the intro for Josh.
You've done great so far.
I'll give you the evening's going to go much better than this beginning. But we'll give you a little flavor. Josh and I met at the Washington City paper. Josh is class of 02, Brown class of 2002. And we both worked right down the street, actually, at Washington City paper. And I have to tell you what a thrill it is to be here to moderate a discussion about a pretty incredible book that's written by someone you know and someone you met early in their career. And I'll just make a plug for City Paper that I hope we have City Paper readers in this room, because without City Paper, thank you. If you enjoyed The Queen, if you enjoyed Ta-Nehisi Coates' books, or Jake Tapper, I think, is doing something tonight on television. We're all watching the Nats game after this.
Catherine Boo is also.
Kate, Pulitzer Prize winner. All those incredible writers and journalists, and one DC council member got their start at City Paper.
One so far.
Well, that's true. Cherkis maybe next, but I really would put in a plug that I know City Paper is doing everyone is challenged for how to make journalism like City Paper work, and I think they're doing a push to have members. So I would just encourage you that if you want to see more Josh Levins, then support your local alternative newspaper. So Josh, I'll just tell a quick story about Josh. One of my most memorable times with Josh is actually related to Brown. We graduated different years, but I think there was one year, maybe 2000, 1995 or so that Brown had a halfway decent basketball team. So that's a laugh line for Brown alums. And we were going to play the powerhouse, Penn. Josh and I think 2 other Brown alums got in a car and drove to Penn to the incredible basketball arena. They have the Palestra, where the outcome you already know. We got pummeled. But we ate 3 cheesesteaks in one, each of us ate 3 cheesesteaks in one night, and so it was a really wonderful evening. And so that kind of is a strange segue, Josh, of getting into sort of the first. So what I thought we would do is leave plenty of time for your questions. But I thought first we would delve into, how you got into this topic and what intrigued you, sort of the origin stories of the book. Then, obviously, we're going to get into something that I think interests me a lot, which is how this book is an intersection of journalism, public policy, and politics that is sort of had an indelible imprint on our civic discussion about welfare policy. And then I also, Josh has prompted me many times, like, I have a lot of policy ideas for you, Alyssa. So we'll talk a little bit about that, and then we'll get into what I hope will be a discussion among everyone. So first, Josh, you have had a pretty incredible career for a young journalist like yourself. Josh was saying he's middle-aged, but I'm a few years ahead of him, so we're still young. You've written thousands of articles for Slate. I'll work in a little bit of your bio for the City Paper, for Slate, for the New York Times, the Atlantic. So what about this story captured your attention and made you want to delve deeper?
Thank you very much for the introduction, and it's great to be up here with you. Good friend, good Brown alum, former colleague. So there is actually a City Paper connection to how this story started. My mentor at City Paper, number 1, is Alyssa Silverman. Number 2 was Tom Skoka, who is a brilliant journalist who was the number 2 editor at City Paper at the time and really taught me how to be a reporter. I had written stories for, when I was in college, but I hadn't really gotten any journalistic training. I was pursuing other things at the time. So when I was at City Paper, I really got that kind of on-the-ground training, learned about DC, learned how to ask questions, learned how to put together an article. And Tom and I kind of came together again when he was writing for Slate around 2012. He was blogging for us. He was writing stories about the presidential election between Mitt Romney, who's back in the news lately, and Barack Obama. And there was this fundraiser where Mitt Romney was reported. It became a big scoop for Mother Jones, where somebody caught him on tape saying there are 47% of people in this country who are essentially moochers, who don't pay taxes, who will never vote for us as Republicans because they just want to take and they don't want to give anything. And this was not great for Romney's candidacy. It played into, I think, stereotypes about what Republicans think and believe. And so Tom was thinking about this and thinking about how to write about it. And he said, do you remember the story about Linda Taylor, the welfare queen in the 70s? And I hadn't heard about it. I had heard the term welfare queen before. I knew the stereotype. I knew how it was a really pernicious stereotype and a pejorative term, but I hadn't known that there was a specific person that the term had been attached to. And so working with smart people, they get you on good ideas, and Tom said, somebody should look into this, and I volunteered myself. And so just from a really kind of initial superficial dive into LexisNexis, other news databases, I found a bunch of stories from the mid-70s about this woman, stories that were told about her that were really outrageous, not just about welfare fraud, but about possible kidnapping, possible murder. And then, when you look at a news database, you can sort it by year. So it's like a lot of stories in 75, 76, 77, and nothing at all had been written as of 2012, 2013 when I started looking into it. And it wasn't like any of these loose ends had been resolved at all. They're just like kind of put out there, and nobody knew or cared to know what this woman's story was. The welfare queen image, and you can see her here, and she's wearing a fur coat, and she has the hat. That image, the stereotype, and how it was kind of used to demonize poor people, poor black women, I think in particular, that lived on, but the actual human being behind it, she was just kind of lost in history. And so I don't think there was anything particularly special about me. Like, I think anybody who would have done that search would have been intrigued by it and wanted to know what the answers were. And then the fact that it was so complicated, that there was this woman who had done, or who was alleged to have done bad things, but who was herself abused and really mistreated by politicians and by journalists, that actually made me more interested. The more complicated the story, the harder it is to tell, but I think the more worth telling it is.
So I wanted to see a show of hands. How many people in the room are involved in government in any way? Okay. How many people are in journalism? Okay, oh, you're a very talented guy. And then how many people are in politics? So on the political side, okay. Okay, good, actually. That's good for a DC crowd. I thought more hands would go up. So I want to get into this issue of your point of view that there was a mistreatment. As a journalist yourself, what role did journalism play in creating this archetype of the welfare queen, and of and do you think that the journalists involved were responsible for that, or irresponsible in their journalism, in that by promoting this story, it created a stereotype of families, and specifically black women who were receive public benefits as being, as you say, moochers, or taking advantage, or cheaters, or not families who had been trapped in structural racism, decades of poverty, and were trying desperately to improve themselves and their children.
Yeah, so I think it's important to start with the advent of aid to dependent children in the 1930s. So a program that was most closely associated with Linda Taylor in the 70s, Aid to Families with Dependent Children. The name had changed, but it was essentially the same program. When it started in the 30s, it was conceived as a program for white widows. And in this country, historically, that's a population that, whether it's politicians or whether it's the mainstream press, that's seen as a deserving population. These are people who, as a society, the idea is like we should be supporting these people. We should be giving them help and benefits. At the same time, you can find stories from the very earliest days of these programs, the New Deal programs, of women who are lying about their husband not being in the house, or people who are claiming more food benefits than they deserve. These were stories that were alluring to the press, but also I think readers. There is a certain sense that if you are not receiving, you might be receiving some sort of government assistance, but the idea is like welfare is just something that somebody else gets. Any program that you yourself are not getting, that's welfare, that's bad. And so I think people, newspaper readers would be inclined to believe that there are certain people that are stealing their tax dollars, that don't deserve this money, that they're cheaters. And as the civil rights movement, as the civil rights movement kind of takes off in the 60s, as the welfare rights movement takes off, and black people, brown people start to get benefits that had previously been denied to them, that's when these programs become really racialized. And that's when you see depictions of poverty being associated more with black people, even as the actual numbers, if you look at statistics, it doesn't really change. Just the idea that black people are now associated with welfare. And then I think because of racism, because of sexism, those attitudes, those programs kind of become more suspect. Just by virtue of even being on the program, you're rendered suspicious. And so that, I think, is the full context for Linda Taylor being written about and becoming this character, this caricature. And I think the journalists who wrote about her did not spend as much time focusing on the stories of people who were maybe being lifted out of poverty, of stories about how food stamps were, like, it's one of the most successful programs in American history as far as helping to end hunger. That's not as fun of a
Okay,
of a
so yeah, I
scandal.
want to get into this. And what I would say is, let's make this a free-flowing discussion. So if you guys want to jump in, just raise your hand and let's make it more of a discussion of everyone. So I don't want to, I don't want to let journalists off the hook here, okay? Because I think, in the book, Josh focuses, I want to get into your method because the meticulousness, for those who haven't read the book yet, the meticulousness of Josh's citations is amazing. When you're reading the book, I can, maybe just because I know you, but I have this vision of you going through microfiche to read all of these stories. But you obviously have an interest in this intersection of journalism and politics and policy, and you focus on George Bliss, who was a Chicago Tribune writer and then gets co-opted, right, to work.
Yeah, he wrote one story about Taylor for Human Events, which was Ronald Reagan's favorite magazine. He wrote that as a freelance piece. But this guy was a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist in Chicago, known as kind of the best investigative reporter in Chicago, and he latches onto this story.
Exactly, so that's what I want to get into, because, so as somebody who's, and we'll keep what I say about district government within this room right now. So one of the reactions I had is that, sort of was Bliss being responsible or irresponsible with his journalism? And I want you to render an opinion on that. Because the reality is there's gray area here, in that in a lot of our social benefit programs, our public benefit programs, they're not administered in the most efficient way. And there's a reason why Bliss was interested, I think, in looking at welfare policy, because there was a belief that there was a lot of waste, fraud, and abuse, so to speak. And in one way, you can say that the unintended consequence, or the intended consequences, is that those who need the help the most will be hurt because of the inefficiency of the program. But Bliss ended up focusing on Taylor and her story, sort of promoting this perception that people are on welfare, are living the high life, taking advantage, driving Cadillacs and wearing fur coats. And so were Bliss and his editors being responsible or irresponsible here?
So Bliss's best work, his best investigations, the Pulitzer-winning ones, were public service stories. He wrote about, or reported out, nursing home abuse in Chicago, and just agency-level corruption And that's how this story started, is that the public aid department in Illinois, reputationally, as you said, there were issues with them distributing money properly, not particularly caring in some cases whether it was distributed properly. And it started out as, the initial story on Taylor was, look how bad this agency is. This woman was able to sign up under all these different names, and there needs to be an investigation. Oh, the other issue was the police found her with these different welfare cards, and the police couldn't get any agency to even care. Like, they found this abuse that was so flagrant, and everybody was just passing the buck. The public aid department said, this isn't our problem. The Social Security office said, this isn't our problem. And so it started out as agency level, institutional corruption and abuse. But the particular details about Taylor, the Cadillac, she was going to take a Hawaiian vacation, she had fur coats, that was the thing that he ended up seizing on. The stuff about the institutional level corruption was really only in like the first story. And then when it got picked up on the wires, I found, you know how wire stories like AP or UPI, they get distributed to papers and they'll run a longer version in some papers and a shorter version in some papers. A lot of the papers I found, they cut out the parts about the agency level corruption and only focused on Taylor because she was so interesting and flamboyant. And so there were dozens of stories about her and like, oh, she was found to be a voodoo doctor, and and they're all like crazy and interesting, but she became the stand-in for welfare recipients in a way that was totally dishonest and inaccurate. And the stories were lacking context. Most of the stuff that was printed, some of it wasn't true actually. Like, there were some exaggerations about the amount of money she got. A lot of it was true, but the thing that was totally absent was context. There were no black editors at the Tribune. There were no women editors at the Tribune. There were just a bunch of white men kind of editing and writing and reporting out these stories that I think didn't appreciate what it would mean to, and the Tribune is the one that's responsible for really popularizing the term welfare queen. I don't think they really understood what it would mean to say welfare queen, welfare queen, welfare queen, welfare queen in scores of articles.
Right.
And that term just spread and took on a life of its own.
One of the memorable slogans of an editor at City Paper, who's unfortunately no longer here with us, was his way of describing what news was. This was David Carr, who some of you might know. Was, you know, planes landing safely at National Airport, not news. Planes crashing, news. So I say that to you, Josh, to say, Linda Taylor news, right? She's flamboyant, she was interesting, she was like an escape artist, always evading police. You know, she is news. And actually, the many families who are on, at then AFDC, now TANF, who are struggling to survive and trying to, and just using what is a very low amount, small amount of money to subsist, is planes landing safely, essentially.
Yeah, I think there's some
Right? So,
argument to be made.
I guess I'm trying to get you pumped up here, Josh. So what would you have done differently? Like if you were Liz's editor and you were presented with this story about this, so it's Chicago. I can, there's many, who took city politics? Did any people in here take city politics, PS 22? So we all read, all of us who went to Brown and took this famous course at Brown always got the best reviews. We read Richard Daley's biography, I think, in city politics, right?
Yeah, the Mike Royko book.
Yeah, the Royko book, Boss. So storied city, lots of corruption. You're presented with this great story about this woman who's, obviously, and you detail it, a fascinating character in her own right. Do you have any responsibility as a journalist to balance that with saying, well, those who are really hurt by the sort of mishandling of the public aid agency are the recipients themselves. Like, so what is the responsibility of journalists to tell that story? Is there any responsibility?
Yeah, I think there is. I mean, just to step back a little bit, I think there's also a responsibility to figure out what is the most important material in the Taylor story.
Okay.
So the fact that she was dubbed the welfare queen, and a huge part of the book is about this, obscured the fact that she had, for instance, likely committed or been connected to multiple homicides, and that she also was, she was certainly arrested for it on at least one occasion, but was responsible for multiple kidnappings. And so the idea that Taylor is somebody who is a fascinating character, deserves to be written about, is not something I would dispute, for example. But the story was told via insinuation. It was told in a way that was sensationalistic but not accurate, and different loose ends were not followed up on, and people who were her victims told me when I interviewed them that they were never contacted by the Tribune, that they were never given justice, and they felt that because her victims were often black people on the margins of society, that the newspaper and politicians didn't care about them. And what they did care about was telling this story about how welfare recipients were bilking the system, because that's what their kind of white middle class readership really responded to and wanted to read. So I would say that. But on the plans landing safely aspect, I think the notion, the initial impulse to say that this is an institutional story. This is a story about agency level fraud and corruption, which is endemic in Chicago across the entire city government. That was an appropriate impulse. And to tell that story by way of anecdote is not an inappropriate impulse. But I think just that aspect of the story got lost.
Okay, so there's certainly, you could see parallels between the Linda Taylor story and what is happening currently in our current political dialogue. So what do you think your investigation of Taylor's story, how do you read the news now? Do you read the news differently given your work on the book?
For sure. I mean, you definitely see the patterns recurring, and I think there's obvious, just direct parallels in terms of conversation about public benefits and public benefit recipients. But the thing that really just chimes, I think, so closely with the rhetoric as described in the book is conversation about undocumented immigrants and the way that Trump and other politicians have talked about them. I mean, Reagan is a major figure in this book, and Trump is not as subtle and crafty as Reagan was by any measure, but the way that particularly undocumented immigrants who committed crimes and committed violent crimes are kind of those stories that are cherry-picked, when if you look at on a statistical level, the people who would know report that immigrants commit crimes at a lower level on a population basis than non-immigrants. But the way that the story is told, where you talk about this Kate Steinle case in California, where it seems like maybe she was shot accidentally by an undocumented immigrant, and the guy is described as a monster, subhuman, that we need to basically seal the border so that crimes like this can't happen. That is kind of Linda Taylor-esque in using a thing that is true but not representative. That's like a thing that's like interesting because it's so unusual, and making it seem like it is actually typical and representative, and using that to twist narratives and to get people riled up and angry and to blame a certain population for the problem.
Okay. Anybody want to jump in? Should we, go ahead.
I will jump. Thank you for writing this book. I may not be able to purchase it this evening, but I worked for many, many years in the nonprofit sector, and most of the work that I did was in basically anti-poverty work, so food assistance, not on the government side, obviously the nonprofit side.
Yeah.
Sometimes there was federal funds that came through the organizations I worked with managed, and such was the case when welfare reform was going through under the Clinton administration in the 90s, and I was working in Seattle. And I worked in the food security department of the Washington State's largest anti-poverty coalition. And I mean, we had, for a pretty enlightened community, we still had a lot of explaining to do on our end. We ran hotlines, we ran a I ran, the food stamp hotline to gauge calls for people who were really afraid of losing their benefits and so on and so forth. But there was still, even in a very compassionate, enlightened, and generous community like Seattle and like the state of Washington, still a lot of welfare queen stereotypes. And because I've always worked in anti-poverty, and because I've lived through and have not even remotely come over the hump of deep poverty myself and homelessness, understanding the myths and stereotypes about what leads to poverty and what can be, instead of really solving it, I think we're making it worse by pigeonholing whole communities. And I guess, I could go on forever, so I'm not going to do that. But the one point I really want to make is, given that, since time immemorial, we've been trying to solve poverty in every single culture, every single community, since we've recorded our own history as humans. We're still expecting people to live in poverty to stand, I call it standing against the brick wall shivering syndrome, instead of, I'm not suggesting that killing people and having multiple welfare under pseudonyms and so on, and driving Cadillacs or whatever is okay, and I would not condone that. But I still don't understand why, and I've faced this myself, why people who are in poverty or on any type of public assistance are expected or aren't expected to have any level of enjoyment, or any manner of something. Have the agency to spend money on what they
So
would
let's
like.
get into this, because I think one thing you wrestle with in the book, Josh, and Reagan sort of draws a line on is the deserving versus the undeserving poor.
Yeah.
So for those who are going to buy the book tonight after this book discussion, and for those who can't, we'll figure out a way for you to get a book tonight. I want you to talk a little bit, without giving too much away, about how it ends up that a story that begins with a police investigation about a burglary, I believe, ends up being one of, probably beside like Mr. Gorbachev tear down his wall, one of Reagan's most memorable lines.
Yeah, I could read a little Reagan passage here, if you'll indulge me.
Not that you were prepared for this at all.
No.
Okay.
People usually like to hear about Reagan in these talks, so I anticipated that. So this is Ronald Reagan's first presidential campaign in 1976, and in New Hampshire, which then, as it is now, was really crucial, especially for an insurgent candidate like Reagan, who was running against an incumbent President Gerald Ford in his own party, and Reagan very quickly had to establish himself as being a serious contender. So that's kind of the context here. So he is campaigning in New Hampshire, Illinois, North Carolina, and Florida. Ronald Reagan won over conservative voters with an endless stream of stories about the hilarious, alarming ineptitude of the United States government. At a luncheon in Nashville, North Carolina, he said a judge had ordered a public aid sheet to repay $1,511 at the rate of $15 a month, and then ordered the welfare department to increase her grants $15 a month so she could pay off the debt. He talked about a family that had its welfare checks forwarded to the Soviet Union, and he said there was a housing project in New York City where you can get an apartment with 11-foot ceilings, a 20-foot balcony, a swimming pool and gymnasium, laundry room and playroom for just $113.20 per month, including utilities. Reagan also told a convoluted but well-received story about a welfare recipient who stole a ham, sold that ham to a store, and bought it back with food stamps. He said the executive editor of the newspaper had been urged by a welfare worker to purchase food stamps, even though he informed them he owned a $40,000 home, a 3-acre lot, 2 late model motor cars, and just had a salary of $400 a week. He claimed there was a student in California who was getting food stamps by virtue of being in school. The kicker, she's studying to be a witch. And though he didn't mention her by name, the Republican presidential candidate also brought up Linda Taylor again and again. In Chicago, they found a woman who holds the record, he said. She used 80 names, 30 addresses, 15 telephone numbers to collect food stamps, Social Security, veterans benefits for 4 non-existent deceased veteran husbands, as well as welfare. The former radio announcer had a way of making the hoariest yarn sound like a fresh outrage. Reagan's casual, confiding delivery assured his supporters they were the upstanding us, fighting to save the country from the corrupt, dishonest them of Washington bureaucrats and the undeserving poor. If someone set out to design a welfare program that would work, they couldn't do better than food stamps, he said in Nashville. You've probably had the same idea when you were standing in the checkout line at the market with your package of hamburger, watching the strapping young fellow in line ahead of you buying T-bone steaks with food stamps. The people in Nashville applauded after Reagan's riff on T-bone steaks, and they laughed when he talked about the food stamp nabbing witch. But the mood changed when he talked about the woman in Chicago. When he said her tax-free cash income alone has been running $150,000 a year, the crowd at the luncheon gasped. This wasn't funny.
So the question would be, why didn't anyone call Reagan out for his race baiting?
People did call him out for both the inaccuracy of the story and for his race baiting. There's a story in the New York Times that said something like race becomes an issue in the Reagan campaign. And that thing that I read about the guy with the T-bone steaks and food stamps, the story there was that when Reagan was in Florida, he changed young fellow to young buck, which was known to be a racial slur. And so there was a story about that, about the welfare queen. There were stories about she hadn't actually stolen under $50,000 a year, which is correct. She hadn't stolen under $50,000 a year. People were fact-checking him. And once it got into like a kind of, it was very similar to how it is now. It was like, Reagan, it was the equivalent of like 4 Pinocchios for Ronald Reagan with the Linda Taylor story. But he could point to things that were written in the Tribune or elsewhere and be like, no, I'm getting this from a newspaper, I'm getting that from this, and it just became this sort of like kind of academic dispute about whether it was technically X amount or technically Y amount. And he just kept telling the story, and crowds just kept kind of cheering him
Well,
on.
but this was in the 70s, in 76,
Yeah.
Reagan lost that
Mhm.
primary, right?
He did lose the primary.
So why did he keep going? I mean, obviously this became a, central would be the wrong word, but notable part of his campaign, his winning campaign, and of his governing as president.
So he had been governor of California before he ran for president, and welfare reform was something that he hung his hat on. And so when he started running for president in 1976, there was a thing he could point to. It accomplished 2 things for him. It was a thing he could bring up, and he had pretty thin accomplishments legislatively. It was a thing you could point to and say, I did that in California. And it was also a thing when the economy is really, really bad, people are suffering from inflation. You can say the reason that your paycheck isn't able to buy as much is because all of these people on welfare are actually getting all the money, which is obviously a tremendous lie, but it's effective rhetorically. So Reagan was, when he started out, his candidacy was considered a joke, like totally unserious, and he gets all the way to a contested convention in '76 against an incumbent president. And so this, helped
do you mind
catapult
if I pause you there?
Yeah.
So why is it effective rhetorically? Is it because, certainly I think racism has to be a big factor here, is a big factor here. But
I should say, like, welfare, as we were talking
right,
about
we all
before.
benefit from some type of public benefits, whether you're a homeowner with the homeowner's deduction, public education, like we all benefit, and in fact, it's, you could argue big corporations benefit from largesse even more. So why was this such it remains, because I think it is part of the anti-immigrant sentiment, right, is that folks are going to come here and then they're going to rely on public benefits, on taxpayer-funded benefits. So why is this so effective? Why don't people turn around and say, well, we all benefit from taxpayer spending, and, immigration has made this country great, and there are many big business people who, like Howard Schultz, for example, who started his life in public housing. So why does this persist in the American story that demonizing welfare recipients and people of color ends up being such a strong rhetorical card for politicians?
I'm curious for people to answer in the audience as well, but my answer is that it's feelings, because for a certain group of people it feels true, and there's this kind of valorization of work, and this idea that I work hard for my money and that I cannot afford X thing, and I'm reading about a person who does not work and who actually is literally taking my money in the form of tax dollars and is driving around in a Cadillac. That's upsetting and offensive. The idea that I'm doing everything right and this immigrant or this welfare recipient is not doing the right thing,
Okay.
and they're like getting ahead, and I'm like can't even afford to do X, Y, or Z. Like I think that's a lot of it.
I'm gonna just gauge audience reaction. Any comments? Well, why don't we let the president have the first question here, Corey?
Well, something that I think is especially applicable to this age as well is just the general fear of socialism. And what you just said is definitely a big motivator, but I think people fear welfare because they fear socialism. They fear, their salary won't be attached to what they deserve and merit, I suppose, and things like that.
So yeah, there's an experiment in Europe, and actually we did a study here at the council about having a basic minimum income.
Yeah.
Do you have any thoughts on that, Josh? So this is the idea that every household would just get a basic payment. And any thoughts about a basic minimum income?
I think there's a certain logic to it, and I think that it's interesting if you go back and look. I didn't know this before I started research for this. Maybe folks in the audience did, but Richard Nixon was a very strong advocate for that. And one of the people, this was when he was governor of California, who came out very strongly against it was Ronald Reagan. And that was another thing that helped raise Reagan's profile nationally. And as we've been talking about, the thing that he came out very strongly about was that there's the dignity in work, that you can't just be giving people things, that you don't make them lazy and entitled, even if you're giving them like, a couple $100 a month, that it's just, I think, people of a certain political persuasion, just the concept, no matter what the actual dollars and cents are attached to it, it's just like offensive and wrong.
Right.
I think there are people that feel that way.
Sean?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Did you see any black media when you were doing this this study actually trying to defend her? Because I know in the 70s and 80s there was a big respectability politics going on at that time, where a lot of the black media wanted to say, oh, we're just no different than everybody else, we're middle class too. And so a lot of them would want to shy away from a story like this because it shows kind of like the negative side of like our culture. You know, so did you see any black media talk about this kind of thing, or did any of them try to defend her?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I'll start by talking about the Tribune. I talked to some black journalists who worked there in the 70s. There weren't very many. One of them was Clarence Page, who you guys might know, who's in DC now and is a very long-standing Tribune guy, said that when the story first came out, he thought it was a good story, and it was like interesting, and he thought like, oh, good job the Tribune covering this. But then when he saw the way that it was distorted and consumed by politicians and other media, he was not happy and didn't think the context, like we were talking about, was really a part of the story, and that was a bad thing. And he also talked about being a young reporter at the Tribune, trying to get them to like care about the Black Panthers. Like, no editors wanted him to write about the Black Panthers. Like, obviously in the 60s, who cares about the Black Panthers? That's not an important story at all. But the Chicago Defender was the very storied black newspaper in Chicago. But by the 70s, it was not kind of at its height at that time. I think because a lot of black journalists had started to be hired at other institutions like the Tribune. She did actually, Taylor did do interviews with the Defender. She never talked to the Tribune, and they were, I wouldn't say sympathetic to her, but she was willing to talk to them and they were willing to talk to her, and she kind of told her side of the story. But she wasn't somebody that was easy to sympathize with. I mean, she was a pathological liar. She was a con artist. As I said, she was a kidnapper and likely a murderer. So I think the Defender was more aware than the Tribune was how this story was getting played because of race, and it was racialized, and there were opinion pieces about how the story was being distorted. But as far as she was concerned, I don't think she was a great advocate for herself, no matter who was covering her.
And one more thing, did you get anything with like Lee Atwater? Because didn't Lee Atwater come up with that whole plan for Reagan to do the Linda Taylor story, and then Willie P. Horton, and then there was another story all at the same time, I thought.
Yeah, so Lee Atwater.
It was
Atwater kind of was helped with the advent of the Southern strategy, and this was the idea that as the South went from being kind of like solidly Democrat and supporting segregationist Democrats like George Wallace to kind of evolving to being more on the Republican side. And as it became, I hate to use this term, but as it became, I'm not going to say politically correct, as it became less socially acceptable to use like out and out racial slurs, to start talking about things like states' rights and things like welfare, that was, Atwater was somebody who was kind of a pioneer of that strategy. And Reagan, I wrote about in the book, having a campaign event in Philadelphia, Mississippi, near the site where the civil rights workers were killed in the 60s. This was another example of how race and racism, it was part of the contemporary conversation about Reagan. It's not something we're just kind of getting to now. But in 1980, when he had that campaign event, it's not like it really stopped him in his tracks in any way. There were a lot of people that were extremely upset by it, and he still won in a landslide. There's a question over here.
Yeah, so just it was funny what you were saying about Reagan and the debate between Reagan and the incumbent, saying he believes in the value of work, because I remember during the socialist primary in France in 2017, there was really the debate between Hamon and Manuel Valls. So Manuel Valls, the prime minister, who was having the same same rhetoric as Regan and Amon that was really for this general income. So it was a really funny statement for me to hear that. But on another note, I wanted to know in your research, as you mentioned, even the conservatives, I mean the Republicans in the mid-60s and in the 70s had like a pretty progressive agenda on social reforms in comparison to right now, of course.
Yeah.
So my question is, what was the appeal for the American public, if you saw it in your research on this book, for them to actually say to withdraw and have kind of this turn back from this program and to get into a much more reactionary program, as you could see under Reagan?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think if you look at a lot of Nixon's policies, they seem like really super progressive for all of, compared to Republicans today, I mean, for all of Nixon's faults. I think that's just objectively true. I think that a lot of it is Reaganism, and a lot of it is kind of his magnetism as a candidate and as a kind of political persona. He's kind of deified and idealized by a lot of folks today, and he was a good spokesperson for the conservative agenda and for this kind of idea, this mythology of people being self-made and how everybody should work for what they get. And I think it's also really important. This is kind of tangential to what you were saying, but there was a reference before to the Clinton welfare reform in the 90s, and that was a bipartisan effort. Like, I don't want to just sit up here and say Republicans bad, Democrats good on these issues. And around 94, when the Clinton welfare reform kind of abetted by Republican Congress as well, when that went through, if you looked at opinion polling, people in every demographic group, by race, age, party affiliation, all of them wanted to reform welfare. Welfare had been so thoroughly kind of demonized, the idea of it was so unpopular, that it helped get Clinton elected when he said, I want to end welfare as we know it. People interpreted that message in different ways, but his pollster said that it was the most effective message that he gave on the campaign trail. Like, everybody wanted to hear that at that time.
So we spent a lot of time talking about policy, but Linda Taylor as a person is absolutely fascinating, right? And so I wanted for you to spend a little bit of time talking about her, Josh. One of the things that was striking to me, so this is, for those of you who are soon to buy the book, this is a woman who had married how many men?
I think like 8.
And she would meet these men, and then a week later they were married, right?
Yeah, that happened once. That happened at least once.
Okay, at least once. But so she's a con artist. There's a question of her mental stability. But in all your research, how did she get away with so much? What did you learn about Linda Taylor as a person in the end? How was she able to do what she did?
So I think there are a lot of reasons that you and I don't commit crimes, Alyssa. One of them being that it's bad. You don't want to do that. Another reason is fear of getting caught.
Okay.
She had no fear of getting caught, and I think that was the number one reason. And it wasn't like she was never caught. She wasn't. Her number one criminal skill was not evasion of law enforcement. She would get found out. She would get discovered. She was very good at evading punishment. And she was very good at not being deterred by things that other people would be deterred by. So
Okay.
she would get caught scamming the welfare system in Michigan. She would skip bail,
Right.
go to Illinois and scam the welfare system there.
Right.
She would scam people on kind of an interpersonal level. So it wasn't all just kind of institutional crime. She would meet someone and say, I'm a psychic or I'm a voodoo priestess, and if you give me this amount of money, I'll like help solve your problems. And sometimes people wouldn't turn around just due to embarrassment that they had been had. And so I think it was just more kind of criminal stubbornness and refusal.
But pretty smart, right? I mean,
In some cases, but in other cases, not smart at all. Like one of the reasons she got caught is that she claimed on a form that she had twins and triplets that are born 5 months apart, and that's not very smart. Like if you don't want to get detected, you would never do that. If you want to get a maximum amount of benefits and either you don't think anyone will care to look, or you think people are so indifferent or so overwhelmed with the caseload that they won't look, you might do that. But if you're just like, number one goal is like, all right, I have to just be really subtle here, just get $1 here, $1 there, you would never behave in the way that she did.
so this might be, so how, did I see your hand go up? No. Oh, go ahead, Gordon.
There's also a function of the time period, right? Because it was a lot harder to, detect criminals back then. Like,
Yeah.
if you read about Ted Bundy, like there was such a lack of coordination between states sharing information that he just moved from state to state, and they couldn't catch him. So it was just a difficulty in sharing information between like police departments and things like that.
I think that's definitely true. She would change her name, she would change her location, she would move from state to state. There's some truth to that. I also think that some of it is bureaucracy and failure to communicate between agencies and within agencies. The main detective that I start off the story with gets sidelined at a certain point because he's a burglary detective, and she gets investigated for homicide, and they're like, you got to sit with this one out because this is for homicide detectives, and he was the guy who really knew the most about her.
Right.
And so that's like an internal Chicago police issue.
So where did all of her money come from?
Where did she get money from? I think from Veterans Agency, Social Security Administration, state welfare departments, from husbands, these sort of interpersonal relationships. But you'll see as you read the book that she is in a lot of different ways a cipher to the people who knew her. She would cultivate these very short-term relationships and then disappear. So people would have a window into who she was and what she'd done for 6 months, 18 months, and then they wouldn't know what happened to her afterwards. And as a reporter, it was very challenging, just as it was challenging to people back in the day to try to keep track of her, to know everything that she did, everyone that she scammed, everything that she got.
Right.
And she didn't have she wasn't putting all this stuff in a savings account. Her plan was not, I'm gonna, do one last job and then I'm gonna get out and retire. She was scamming until the very end. Like it was a kind of obsessive.
Well, she seemed to earn, I guess I was impressed in a way, and how she was able to earn people's trust very quickly, right?
Yeah.
And the fact that when they look back, they can't believe that she earned their confidence, right?
Yeah.
And it happens time and again.
Yeah, I mean, she had an amazing ability to be who people wanted her to be and to be able to discern who people wanted her
She's
to
a very
be.
good politician.
Yeah, and a lot of people told me like, oh, and we haven't gotten into this, and I think maybe we could save it for the book, but her childhood, which I get into in detail in the story, kind of circumscribed her life in a lot of different ways. And a lot of people said, oh, if she had different opportunities, then maybe she would have become a used car salesman or a CEO or a president.
Right.
And
She certainly had a skill of being able to size up a situation, figure out how to take advantage of it,
Yeah.
and earn the trust of those around her very quickly.
I have one question for you before we finish up, if that's
Okay.
allowed. Turn the tables.
Sure.
Do you want to sit here and I can sit there? What do you see as being kind of the policy implications of a story like this? Or how do you, in your work, how do you see the ideas about welfare and welfare recipients? How do they manifest in our politics and in policy?
Yeah, so I was reading the story with that lens. I mean, the reality is, let's say in the district that I think a family of 4 on TANF, which is AFDC now, earns about $469 a month. But what
Not that much more even than it was
right.
40 years ago.
It hasn't been
which is
indexed
crazy.
for inflation. But what I found interesting is that you talk about sort of at the end, the Clintonian version of welfare reform. And it is more complicated because, so certainly no one can subsist in this city on $469 a month. But there's what's known as a welfare cliff, which is, so we have a system in which people are incentivized basically not to be honest in some ways because, certainly you can't rent an apartment on the city earning $469 a month, so likely you have some type of housing voucher. But if your income exceeds a certain amount, so we incentivize people to work, right? So that was, Clinton was all about welfare to work, so the deserving poor work. Although, then again, we believe that dignity, there's a certain dignity in work, so it is complicated.
And we also want people to stay home and take care of their kids. We're like setting up people that there's nowhere to win.
Well, but what I thought, exactly. And what I thought was interesting was this, I think there was, either it was Reagan, I can't remember if it was Reagan or Clinton, pointed out, what their picture of what the deserving public benefits recipient was, and it turned out her story was a lot more complicated, I think, in that she didn't report her additional income because she knew she would hit what we call the welfare cliff, and that then she would lose all of her public benefits in terms of housing if she accurately reported what her family's income was. So since I pressed you, I'll say that there are families in our public benefit system who you talk to and they don't want to work. Is it because of, generational poverty and that they're so hopeless? But there is a certain segment of people, although I would argue it's a small segment. And then there are a lot of, then there are people who are in our city who just don't have hope. They just don't feel like whatever, no matter how industrious they are, that they're going to be able to succeed. And then there are the hopeful families who, are doing everything possible, taking advantage of the work training programs and so forth. Here's what I'll say as a city politician, which I was about to go down that path and then I diverted. In that, so we incentivize people to work, but we don't have pathways into the most successful careers in this city. So what I would say is that, if you think about, well, what are the big industries? We're still a government town, that's true. The federal government is the biggest employer here, although the private sector now has more jobs than the public sector. And our biggest industries are things like healthcare. So our hospitals are our biggest private sector employers. Yet we don't have any pathways for, let's say, a single mom on TANF to get into our biggest industries. And then some of our biggest industries have structural impediments to you know, because if you're on welfare, if you're on a TANF, you have dependents, you have children, and often they're young children. So, for example, one of our other biggest, so hospital work is shift work. It's not a 9-to-5 job. So what do you do with your children if you get the 3 to 11 shift? That's true in our other big industries too. So if you think about the hospitality industry, restaurants, hotels, well, the most lucrative shifts are at night. What do you do with your kids? You know, so there are, I think, big issues that we haven't confronted, and that we are setting people up to fail.
Well, and a lot of the promise of the Clinton welfare reform was that there would be robust job training, and that gets passed along to the states in the form of block grants, and the states use the money on whatever, not whatever they want, but the states often use that money on definitely not that. And so...
Or they do use it. I mean, I will tell you, so one of the big eye-opening things to me as a council member I was trying to rope Brown back in here, and I was thinking, you know, sort of the concepts of, well, you know, public benefits do work. Part of the problem is we have vendors, we have people who are supposed to do that job training, provide that job training, who don't end up providing any jobs. And I think it's not just an issue and that's a little bit, when I was reading Bliss's reporting about the waste, fraud, and abuse in the public aid agency, I think a lot of it is about the people who benefit from our government, who are the contractors, who are not incentivized in any way. I mean, so one of the things that I am very interested in right now is how we do contracting. Because we don't measure, so you think, okay, I'm a TANF workforce development provider, right? So there's a single mom who's on TANF, wants to work, wants to get off public benefits, and your role is to connect that, give that person a certain set of skills and then connect them to employment. Well, for many, many years in this city, we have given money hand over fist to these providers, and we have not expected any kind of outcomes-driven performance. We have not said, okay, you know, you have to connect this many people to employment and make sure that that family or that mom has the support she needs and that she's going to stay off public benefits. We don't measure success. And I think that's probably part of the problem, because there's a whole group of, there's a whole poverty industry of people who benefit off of public benefits that are not the actual recipients. They're the contractors.
That's a great point, and my last thought for the evening, although I'm happy to chat.
Well, are we ending at 8 or 8:30?
I think let's end now, and then if people want to chat after, you could also, they have books for sale up at the cash register. I'm happy to sign the book if anybody wants to. But I think, you know, we've talked a couple times during this conversation about why certain things kind of take root, why certain stories take root, and what journalistic responsibility entails given that. And, you know, George Bliss and other people for the Chicago Tribune, they didn't just write about Linda Taylor, they also wrote about eye doctors who were billing for, you know, hundreds or thousands of dollars in glasses, or pharmacists who were overbilling, just like Medicaid provider abuse and this kind of contracting abuse. And the thing, they did a good job pointing that out, and I don't know if it's the fault of politicians for not focusing on it as much, or if it's the fault of like us as a society for not seizing on it, but there's not a stereotype. There, you know, we have the welfare queen, but we don't have the, you know, I don't know what the pithy version is. Maybe that's the problem, but like
the mom,
the Medicaid providing like thief. which are,
They'll know those happens because we got no opioid.
Right, well, but, or do we have the family who successfully was able to build a career after, workforce training through a public benefits program. I don't want to get you off the hook just yet, Josh, because one thing I think that, how many people here have considered writing a book or are thinking of writing a book? Okay, so I just want you to talk for a moment about the book writing process, which for me seems like the absolute loneliest endeavor you can possibly engage in. But I think there's this belief that all of us have perhaps one good book in us. I'm skeptical about that with me, but so tell us just a little bit of what it is like to write a book. Like how did you do it? What was the process? You have voluminous citations. How did you go about researching this woman's life?
So I think it's important when you talk about stuff like that to be honest about the kind of support you receive, whether it's financially or institutionally, because a lot of times the difference between being able to write a book and not is whether you have that institutional and financial support. So it started off as an article for Slate where I'm on staff, and so I was able to do that just in the normal course of my job. And so I wrote a very long article and made a lot of contacts with the folks who I ended up interviewing for the book by virtue of that process. And that article also was a good advertisement for the book, that publishers were interested because it was a popular and well-received story. And because of that, the way that it works in nonfiction publishing is that you write a proposal and then you have an agent and they send it out to different publishing houses. And so I was able to get an advance that allowed me to take some time off of work to, again, financially support me to do the work. So I want to make sure that is all clear. It's not about just you gotta work hard and try your best and you can do it. But I was able to have time to do the voluminous research that this required. It was kind of a combination of tracking down people that knew her, tracking down records in different jurisdictions, filing freedom of information requests to try to shake things out, going to archives, and then reading books to learn about Reagan or learn about the history of welfare policy in the United States. And so then it just becomes kind of like a organizational challenge and a challenge of turning all the research into a narrative, and I had help from friends and editors and all of that. So it was really hard work. I'm not going to sugarcoat it, but it's as a writer, as a journalist, especially now working in digital media, it's very cool to have an actual thing that's on a table that has my name on it and is in a library. That's very, very neat and rewarding. And it's also, I don't want to minimize all of the help that I got because the book wouldn't exist without it, but it is also, it feels like kind of a culmination of a lot of what I've done over the years and kind of the fullest realization of the work that I want to do. And so, yeah, I'm happy that it exists.
Well, congratulations, Josh, and thank
Thank
you
you.
so much. So the book is available for sale.
Yeah, you can go out and buy it at the register out there if you want to come back in.
Okay, and
I
you'll
can
be
sign
signing books over
it. I
here.
would be happy to sign or chat or whatever.
Excellent, and happy to chat with everyone as well. Thank you for coming. Appreciate the Potter's House having this.
And thank you to the Brown.
And thank you to Brown Club. And we talked about upcoming events. Anything you want to note, Corey, before we close out?
Yeah, the ticketing site for the membership event is live, so you can purchase your ticket now for Professor Gutman talking about toxic masculinity. Very very timely topic. And then we also have a holiday party in December, which is a more, casual fun event.
Great, thank you guys.
Thank you.
Oh, are we? Okay.
Great job.
Pleasure to meet you.
So actually, we're more often.
Oh, cool. Let me go get my